we're going to get started in now. So since we've last talked, let's kind of recap. We had this course overview call last week. And then hopefully, like, if you're at the point of watching this lecture, you should have seen the HTML fundamentals lecture, the image types, CSS rules, more tags, like all of these here. If you have not watched these, then generally speaking, it would be good to go and watch them, because everything today kind of relies on that knowledge. Okay, so if you don't have that, go watch that. We're jumping straight now into the start of week 2, which is the HTML CSS page demo, where we're going to kind of demo a little bit more with HTML and CSS. And how we're going to start this lecture is that I'd actually like to pause and I'd like to ask you all, tell me some websites you like, just a few of them, you know, and just tell me in the chat, because what we're going to do is we're actually going to go and look at some of those together. And this lecture is actually, it's a very demo lecture. There's not much theory. So the entire lecture is literally just us. We're gonna look at Perla. Yeah, sure. We're going to look at a few sites and essentially just figure it out. Normally we do this with kind of a poll, like prior to the lecture, but it's kind of a bit more fun to do it in person. So I've got a few different things. We got Apple, we got Pinterest, we got Netflix, we have Perla. Some of these are quite complicated websites, to be perfectly honest. So I'm just waiting to see what happens in the chat here. YouTube, yep. Some more. Right. Canva, Twitch, Twitter. These are all very boring. Stream, okay. Steam, not stream. Wikipedia. You're all going crazy. I'm going to have to cut this part of the video out because of how much just random stuff. Okay, there's a bunch of stuff. Airbnb is really interesting. I might actually do Airbnb because it's actually tied to one of your later assignments. So if we go to Airbnb here and we look at a website like this, I think what we might do is we might kind of get started a little bit and like look at how to construct some of these components. Because like if you're at this point in the course, then you kind of understand the basics of HTML and stuff. You might just not have gone and applied them, right? Maybe you've done a couple of lab exercises or not. I'm not too sure, but hopefully you might have started on an assignment. And I want to just kind of give you a sense, and I know many of you have kind of gotten quite deep in this, so it's like, cool. You're fairly confident, but for those of you who haven't started, because there will be a bunch of students that just have not started assignment 1. Most people would not have started assignment 1. And what I want to do here is I want to focus on just a few kind of key elements to start, right? We won't go and try and construct this page necessarily, but let's go and try and construct elements of this page. So for example, let's actually just take a look at this particular like little block here. You know, this image and this text underneath, and let's go and try and play around with that. So what I've got up here is I've got this web page called index.html, and I've got a text editor up here called index.html as well. And we really just want to be able to kind of go and copy that. Now, something that I might do just to make my life a little bit easier is I might go and just in this lecture go and take this. I'm going to go take a quick screenshot of this, and I'm going to go and save it in the folder that I'm working on so that we can look at it together. I'm going to call it like reference.png. Now you can't see anything up on your screen at the moment. That's okay. That's normal. I'm just going to reopen this. I've got some file system problems. And there's my reference image. So the first thing we're going to do on this page, just for fun, is we're going to include reference.png on the page. Now, this will just mean that as we're coding, we can see that. and then I might give it, I might use some CSS to give it a particular size. Now, if you've gone and watched the pre-recorded lectures, you know that you can add CSS to any HTML element just by adding some styles here, right? In this case, I might do a 200 pixel style width. Now, remember, most images, when you put them on a web page, they will stick to an aspect ratio that's fairly fixed. So in this case, I don't have to control the height. If you change the width or the height, it will maintain that aspect ratio and, and grow or shrink basically. So let's try and construct the page above that. Now, all of our pages here, they all have the kind of same basic elements. We have our, our head, our body. Does someone want to tell me what the head does? Obviously, HTML kind of makes sense. It's like all the HTML on the website. But we have this head and body tag, and maybe the one basic thing is that all pages have this title tag. We'll call it Airbnb. And you'll see that, when I save that, it'll update the title up the top here. So that's one of the obvious things. But then we got a body tag, and again, you might also know that, that works like that. So I've asked people what goes in the head tag. A few people have said metadata, metadatas. David says, is head more like information about the page? Yeah, so, the formal kind of definition of what the head is it has nothing to do with what's rendered on the screen. So the head is information about the page that isn't about how it's displayed, essentially, or how people interact with it. And you're all correct, it is to do with metadata. So the most common things that you'll see there are information for crawlers. That's companies like Google and Bing that are scraping these websites. A really good example would be that, let's say we go to take a slides.com website. This is a website I used to use to make slides. If we look at the source code and we look at the head tag, we can see where the head ends. It's down here, and you see there's a ton of stuff here. And let's quickly break this down for a second. So I can tell you what a lot of these things are. So what a lot of these things are, these are verification tags, and where these are actually used, this is not to do with the course, but typically when you use a tool like Google Analytics, and in fact, I use Google Analytics on the course website, and I'll show you this right here. It's very cool. Google Analytics is a tool. This is all tangential. I'm just having fun with you here. You don't need to worry about not knowing some of this. I know some of you already kind of know this. But I'm just trying to find it. But there are tools out there on the internet like Google Analytics, and Google Analytics is a tool that helps you analyze websites. So for instance, the course site, this site here, I actually use Google Analytics to track things. And I've got this, if you look up here, this is actually the Google Analytics of the course site. And you can see, if you look at it, that there's a lot going on here. It says there's 4 people using it right now. These are the top pages. This is how many people in the last 7 days have used it. This is the average session duration. I can see roughly what, and this is all anonymized aggregate data. So this doesn't tell me who you are or what a single person's doing. Google aggregates all this data together, right? I can see that 90% of people access it on desktop, and the majority of you seem to access it on Tuesday night, right? So the most common thing people clearly use the course site for is to find the lecture link. Course site's quite slow to load. Don't know. I haven't noticed that too much. Seems okay. Not sure. So what these tags are, which are quite interesting, is these tags are actually just when you set up a service like Google Analytics, what they ask you to do is they actually ask you to add some metadata to your head so that Google can tell it's you, right? Because imagine you're Google. Imagine I come to Google Analytics and I say, hey, I want you to track what people do on slides.com, or something like this. This isn't quite what it's used for. I'm summarizing a few things. Google's like, how do I know you own that website? How do I know it's yours? So they're like, if it's really yours, go and add this piece of code to the head. And if we see it there when we scrape it, then we know it's yours because we just gave it to you. So sometimes you'll see some tags like this in the head that are used for something like this. I have no idea what theme color is for. This right here is something to do with things like Google Analytics and other tools. This is a way that they're capturing many other tools. And then as we get higher up, we find some other interesting things, which are, these are links to CSS that are stored kind of on another file. So externally imported CSS. So this is how, you know, they're using a few things here, particularly fonts here. This is to do with fonts, not to do with other stuff. There's some metadata to do with how mobile stuff work, and then probably one of the more interesting ones is you'll see some of this metadata that says OG. And OG in this case stands for Open Graph. And Open Graph is really a standard that I think Facebook kind of championed, which specified like a common way for websites to share the basic information about them. And you can actually see this if you, you know, Open Graph debugger. And there's tools, tons of them on the internet, right? They're just free tools where I think like Facebook would have one. Open Graph Facebook tool. Graph API Explorer. Well, what you can do is you can, oh, okay, maybe not. Someone might know a link. I never really remember what these are. I just Google them. Let me try Open Graph Metadata tool. Basically, you can punch in a URL and what it will, yeah, like this one, right? So I can type in slides.com. Now have a look at these OG tags up here. When I punch those in, you'll see that it actually shows me, and you'll see all this information makes sense. Slides, create and share presentations for free. Create and share presentations for free. Slides is a place for creating and sharing, you know, blah, 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 blah. This image right here is the image. So every time you actually share a link or a post on, say, you know, Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or something, it's actually looking at that metadata. That's where it's getting that information from here. So it's really quite interesting. And then we have another thing here, which is a description. This is like an old style version of this one, which something like Google uses. So in a similar way, if you Googled, you know, slides.com into Google, you would see some information there like this. Slides is a place for creating, sharing, and that's where this kind of comes from. And then obviously we have the title and a few other things, you know. Yeah. So really interesting side question. Actually, Blake, let me come back to that question later if that's all right. So that was a bit of a deep dive, but a little bit of a fun nugget of info. But the point is all the stuff in the head's kind of like, meh. Like for the sake of this course, you're not really going to be that interested in it. We're mainly going to be focused in what's in the body. So if we come back to our simple web page here, we go, all right, well, there's a few things here. I'm going to firstly go and grab this image. Now, obviously, I'm being a little bit cheeky, just stealing it straight off Airbnb. They are not being very friendly. It looks like I might need to full screen this to get it. Okay, is this the image? Good. Okay, I found the image, right? So I know the image URL. I can add that to my page here. Now, obviously, I'm actually pulling that off Airbnb's website. What stops them from stopping me? Well, not a lot. They probably have a lot of very advanced systems in place that if I loaded pages from their website, you know, like 1 million times a second or something, they'd block it. But, you know, generally, they're pretty chill with it. So I've got this image here. I might kind of downsize this image a little bit with more style tags. Let's say, you know, width is 200 pixels. I'll do the same thing. And then if I look at the reference image here, might make that 400 because this is awfully small. 400 for both. Right? Then in this case, what are some obvious things we notice? Well, we notice that the image on the right is cropped a bit. Now, this is quite interesting because when it comes to images, there's two ways you can generally deal with images, right? The first way is to use the image tag like we've gotten here, and it's a really good basic way to use images. The problem with it though is that it's a little bit limited with what you can do to manipulate images in terms of like, to the best of my knowledge, you can't really crop an image if it's an image tag. Maybe there's some new CSS I don't know about. But another way we can do it besides using the image tag is we can actually create a div. Now, you know that a div is a kind of block element with no base properties, and instead of using, you know, the image, I can come and set a background that is a URL of that. Now by itself, if I save this, you'll see that nothing seems to happen. But if I go and put something inside the div, hey, you'll notice that suddenly it appears, right? And suddenly it appears because divs by default have a height of 0. So this is one of the downsides of a div. When you use an image, you can't do some things like cropping it, but what you can do is, rely on the browser to figure out the size of it naturally here, right? So in this case, I might have to go, well, how big is this image? 400 by 320, say. Okay, well, now I kind of need to more manually set my background size, to that size there. Now, obviously, that's not really working here because the image is kind of blown out a bit. So you can also play around with it and not just set the background URL, but you can add more CSS to set the background size. And if you give it something like 25%, it'll actually shrink it down. Now, this is the really interesting thing about background images, is when you shrink them down, they have a default property to repeat themselves in both the X and the Y axis. So I've obviously kind of overkilled it here. And I might play around with this until I get the size I like, and you can do it. I mean, you can set the background size too. You don't actually have to do percentages. You can set 400 pixels by 320, which will get it to the exact size. Whereas without that, it just puts itself in as the natural size. If it's too small, it repeats. If it's too big, it just kind of crops itself down. So now we've got this kind of background image, and what this allows us to do is actually play around with some stuff. So for instance, if we want it to be square, we could actually, I don't think we want to, like we could say, okay, well, let's change the 400, change it to 320. What this does though is it doesn't actually move where the image is. What it does is that it kind of just shrunk down the reference, and then it tessellated it basically. So now, if I go back to 400, it's fine. What we actually want to do here is we want to change the size of the element, not the background size, to 320, right? So if I do that, now we actually get that kind of nice square looking thing. The problem is though, the image is in the wrong spot. So there's another property we can deal with, which is our background position, which is where we can control where that background is. So if I say set the background position to 200 pixels, what it kind of does is shifts, I think might need two. Generally when you're doing two properties, it's like X and Y, or width and height. And in this case, what it's doing is it'll shift it across. Now remember, the image repeats here. So if I shift it across 200 pixels, it's kind of like pulling an endless line of images across. So then what I need to do is actually set the background repeat to, I think it's none, or no repeat, no repeat, and that will stop that happening. So now when I shift the image along in different directions, I'm going to get different kinds of effects. But what we saw before was that the problem isn't the image is that it's too far to the left and we need to move it to the right. It's too far to the right and we need to move it to the left. And you just think about some basic mathematics. It was 400 pixels and now it's 320. That's 80 pixels less. So if we want it to be perfectly centered, all we really need to do here is move it negative 40 pixels in the X direction. So move it left. And then we get that image nice and center aligned. So you can see you can do some really powerful things with divs and background images here. And the other thing we want to do is, if you look at the image below, it has a border radius. It's got like nice little curved corners. So we can do the same thing. Border radius, say 10 pixels. You can play around with it a bit. That seems like a little bit minor. Maybe I could try 15 pixels. Okay, that's starting to look pretty similar to the image, right? So border radius is how cornered the radius used to be. I always like to use border radius as an example because back in the day, when I say the day, I mean like 15 years ago or like 10 years ago even, before CSS was advanced enough to do border radiuses. So nowadays you can just make a box in CSS and it just kind of looks like this. It's got a little border radius. But back in the day, what you actually had to do is you had to construct a series of divs in kind of like, you had to construct this like center div, and then what you did was you constructed another div that was like here, that was like one border, and then another div that was like here, that was like another border, and then another div that was like here, that was another border. And then you literally had to put images in the corners because browsers were not capable of rounding edges. It just wasn't built into it. So you'd actually have to kind of go and create in like Photoshop or something, a little corner image like that, a little rounded corner image. And then you would simply reuse that corner image and I don't even think you could rotate it. I think you actually needed 4 different corner images. And then these were actually just a side image that was 1 pixel high that you would repeat. Because browsers can repeat backgrounds, as we've seen. So like, you know, if you go on the internet 15 years ago and you saw a nice little rounded box, you know, it used to be like, everything's very difficult. And similarly, nowadays, you probably sit here and think, oh man, this stuff seems really tedious. And it's like, yeah, well, you know, technology will keep advancing. You will look back in 10 years at some things we have to do here today of like, you know, setting background size and stuff. And there'll just be things like, you know, background position, something center. I might even work. I'm not sure if center works. There you go. See? I mean, this is an old school thing, but like center worked there. And if you forget what you can do with these things, you can simply Google them, you know. If you Google a CSS property, you'll typically get taken to the W3 Schools site and they will show you all the different things you can do with it. So in this case, for background position, you can do left top, left center, left bottom. You know, you can kind of do these kinds of things. And if you just say one word like right, the browsers will interpret that as right, and if just left will be left, and, you know, and center will be center. Or you could do the percentages, right? And if you just do 1%, it's the same value for X and Y. Or what we did before was the X pos, Y pos. So, you know, a lot of playing around that you can do here. So we've got ourselves this little border radius, which is good. Good start. Sorry. And now we want to kind of play around with the text. So let me get rid of this old image thing on the high here. Oop, we need a love heart. Yeah, we do need a love heart. That's true. Okay, someone says we need a love heart. Well, love hearts are not in CSS. Maybe in 10 years there'll be a love heart in CSS, but it's not right now. So let's look at how Airbnb does it. I need to make this bigger again. Okay, so what we can see is that Airbnb is actually using an SVG here, which is quite interesting. So an SVG, remember, if you've seen the image types lecture, it's a vector. It's a vector object. So what I can do is I can actually go and say, take this from the browser, and I can copy the outer HTML. The outer HTML gets all of the inner HTML plus the tag I've highlighted, and I can actually go and paste that, for instance, here if I want to, and I will now have that love heart, probably. I don't know where the love heart is. What have we done wrong? Where's the love heart? If we're not sure, like, okay, so let's say you're in the situation like I am. What you do is you debug it. You go and like make another div somewhere. You know, let's make a div with some, you know, width 200 pixels, height 200 pixels, something really simple, and we'll give it a border. You know, you play around with it just so you can really get a feel for it. So it's like, okay, I've made a div. Now let's put the SVG inside of it. There's my SVG. So you're like, cool, right? I was confused before. Now when I see that it's gray, I can actually see it up here, right? I didn't see that before, right? I don't know if you did. If you did, you have giant brains. But what this tells us is that something's wrong with the SVG. And in particular, if I go and try and destruct the SVG, which we don't expect you to do in the course, right? But it is kind of a useful skill. You can see that the way this SVG is structured is that it's essentially saying that here's the properties of the SVG, but the shape is defined by all this confusing stuff here. Now this is the shape of a love heart. I'm obviously never going to be able to change that. I have no idea how, that's gibberish, right? But what I can see is that the fill here is this particular color, RGBA, which is red, green, blue, alpha. And what this is saying is that it's black at 50% transparency. You know, but I don't want it to be black. I want it to be completely transparent. So maybe we could try it at, you know, not 50% transparency. It's like 50% opacity, technically. So if I do 0, it means completely see-through. But I also want it to have like a border. You can see here that there's a stroke width. I'm not sure what stroke var any of this is here. I'm very confused. I don't know what happens if we pick black. Okay, so stroke is like the outside, and you can see there's some black, or maybe, you know what, let's actually color it in white. 255. Okay, now we've got a cute little love heart. But you can see on the website it's actually the other way around. They've got a white stroke and kind of like a semi-black background. So if you actually take a step back, you can see that how this works on Airbnb is they've got the right background color, which is this kind of dark black, but the stroke here is white. Now, I don't know what this var thing is. It's probably something more complicated to do with like how they're managing all their SVGs, but I could just go and put the white color code in here, and now we have the same thing as them. Now we have to position it effectively. Well, how can we do that? There's a few different ways we could do this. We could probably start playing around with like some position absolutes and stuff if we want to, right? So there's a few generally different ways of placing things again. There's tables, which are old school. There's like floats, there's position, and then there's like flexbox. For something like this, usually doing like a position absolute is like a smart idea because it lets you, and again, I'm assuming you've watched the lecture here, so I'm not going to cover it too much. I'm just going to play with it. I often forget how these work, but I'm playing with it here. Basically, if you set something as position absolute, it might not even need to be absolute. It could just be relative. Both you can work with. You're setting it to the top left corner here. So you can see this little love heart here is in the top right. So what I can actually do is very easily, I can actually just say, well, let's go and put you like 20 pixels from the right, and let's go and put you 20 pixels from the top. What's the problem I have here? Well, with it being absolute, it's like treating itself with respect to like the outer page, right? Now, how do you get around this? Again, if you go watch the lecture, I think there's a couple of ways. One of them is like, if you create something that's an absolute position, it always tries to place itself absolutely within the next relative position in like the tree. But in this case, because there was no relative position, it like defaulted to the same page. You can see that the positioning is like slightly off here, so I might change it to say like 12 pixels. That's not enough, should be 15. Okay, that's starting to look probably like 18, I don't know. Looks mostly okay. That's probably fine. But now we've got that nailed pretty well, right? Now you can see that I can't really click on that SVG. That's okay. Airbnb are going to use some JavaScript and stuff to like make that work a certain way. So that's all JavaScript happening there. Just before I move on to the next thing, is there anything people would change at this point? Hover property of the heart. Yeah, that's fair. So how do we do hover property of the heart? Well, it's a good question actually. I'm not too sure. David says, do you mean about my life or so far the website? Yeah, no, I mean about the website. Blake says, does the position absolute work well if you zoom? Yeah, it does, because the absolute is again still within the relative positioning of the parent component, you know? So, you know, it works fine with zoom. Okay, hover property. So hover properties are pretty easy because typically like hover properties, you can just change the CSS and add that hover tag. I'm actually not too sure how to do it with SVGs, to be perfectly honest. I guess it's probably pretty easy because SVGs just have styles as well, which is probably a good time to like actually take a step back and say, well, let's go and add an explicit, you know, style tag up the top of the page here, like this, right? Now what I can do is I can start extracting out some of these styles, right? So this one here, for instance, we'll call this like, you know, image box or something, and we'll rename it to class. And I can start going and, you know, making these styles a little bit more readable. So break them up per line, you know. There we go. And then I can also add another one, which is say like heart. And what I can do with heart is I can go and take these styles here that we saw before, and I can do the exact same thing. I can pull them out and start to clean up my HTML. And this is where the separation between, you know, style and structure comes into play. This is where we start to actually see like, cool, separation. And it makes the HTML a bit easier to read. Again, because I'm now referencing a class, I can't use the style attribute. I use the class attribute. You know, so this kind of works now, but what this is cool is I can now say, well, let's define what happens when I hover over heart. And let's say that I just want the fill to turn from, you know, half transparent black to half transparent red. See if this works. There we go, like that. We also notice it feels a little bit awkward because the cursor doesn't change. So usually on a lot of hovers, you need to add cursor pointer. Like this. So you see how that's already starting to feel more natural? That's the limit of what you can do basically with CSS. To actually make a lot more stuff happen, you start to need to use JavaScript, but we've got that heart there okay. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to like start to use the bottom part of that image. What I might actually do is like swap that image around with the div box so I can see the bottom of it a bit. No, it's not really going to make a difference, is it? All right. So now let's start adding the bottom part. Now the bottom part's kind of interesting because we've got our image box, and then immediately under the image box we're going to have a few things. Generally when I'm kind of coding CSS, I think it's easiest to go and put the content in like kind of divs and spans and then style it out. So for instance, what I'm going to do here is like I'm going to create a div that's like the first line, and then I'll create a span that's like Abby and Samal, Indonesia. And then, you know, I'll have another span that's like star 4.88, like that. And then, you know, I'll have another div for like 4631 kilometers, another div for like 13 to 18 April, and then another div for like, you know, 2536 AUD total. And you can also see that, you know, that AUD is a little bit brighter like this, and the whole thing is actually underlined as well. So, you know, that's like a starting point, and this will get us like a little bit of the way. If I refresh the page, you'll see the contents there now. Blake says, how about fading the color on hover rather than cutting it straight to red? Yeah, so this gets into animations, which is like CSS animation, where you can start, I don't know these off the top of my head, but you can essentially start adding like an animation duration to most properties. I sincerely don't do a lot of this these days, but so I'm a little bit out of my depth, but let's try it out. I don't know if you put it on the hover, if you put it on the actual element, but we can figure that out. Someone here is going to know better than me. It's not it. Where was the other page? Animation duration, like 4 seconds, right? So if I just say put it here for 4 seconds, see if that does anything. Nope. See, I'm clearly missing something. The keyframe thing's really interesting. And I assume that's some kind of missing here where it's like, yeah, okay. So let's actually stop and read the code. I can create an animation. I'm not sure how to apply it to hover. I think that's the weird part. But let's give it a try anyway. Give it a shot. Let's say we're going from background. Is there anything to do with hover? Let's have a look. I don't know. CSS animation hover. Yeah. Give me a not crappy website, please. Transition, background color. Try that out. I might have gotten down a rabbit hole with animations. I was like, this seems a bit much. So let's try this. We got what? Transition, which is to change the fill. 2 seconds, ease out. 100 milliseconds. Let's try that. See if that does anything. Yay. Okay. So I'm not sure what the 100 milliseconds is for. It's clear here that's like, okay, what it's saying here is that as a property changes, the property fill, spend 2 seconds changing, you know, transitioning between that property. And there's a certain way they want you to transition it, which is ease out. I'm not sure what the 100 milliseconds is. So let's have a look at that, right? CSS transition. CSS transitions. What do we got? So transition delay, duration, property, and timing function. Okay. What order are they in? I assume they're in that order. There's the delay. How does that work? Where do they give me the... Because remember, most things you do tend to have these shortcut methods. right? Which 2 seconds, the linear 1 second. Now, I'll dig a little bit more into this whole what's the difference between timing or delay and duration. Sure, okay, I understand now. Property is the interesting one, because property, there's a few different... Where is it? Property. Transition property. Or timing function, sorry. Yeah, that's what I mean, timing function. So when it comes to most like transitions and animations, there's typically like a few different ways that things can move. And they're all kind of specified here. There's like ease, you know, which slow start, then fast, then slow at the end. So, you know, ease is like a, you know, like a like that. You know, linear is like the same speed the entire time. Ease in's like a slow start but speeds up. Ease out's like a slow end. Ease in and out. I don't know what the difference between that is and ease. So there's a few different things you can play with, and like it can be quite notable. For instance, if you toy with them. So let's, you know, instead of ease out, we could use like ease in. Now I'm pretty sure what's happening here is this 100 milliseconds is the delay. So it's like, you know, when I put my mouse over it, nothing should happen for like 0.1 of a second. 2 seconds is how long it takes. So if I shrink that to 1 second here, what we get is something that appears much quicker. And you notice that this ease in method, it's like quite slow to start. And it like appears quite suddenly. Whereas if I do like an ease out method, it's the other way around. So, you know, it appears much quicker. It's like quite red suddenly, and then it like tones out at the end. These are very hard to kind of see in these particular scenarios. Like I could make it a bit more obvious if I got rid of the background image, I think. You know, so again, this one's like quite quick in and then tapers off, whereas ease in is like quite slow in. Oh, it's really hard to see over those time frames. If I make it like 3 seconds, it might be easier. So that's quite slow to get going. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Blake's right. It's easier to see with something that's moving, because you can actually like, you know, watch it across the screen, which is much better than trying to watch colors change. So let's stop wasting time on animations, even though that was a great suggestion from someone. Thank you. And let's get stuck into instead this bottom part down here. Now, one of the most obvious things you'll see is fonts. There's some different fonts here, and if we go to Airbnb, and this kind of ties into the question that Blake asked, which was like, you know, can we provide the fonts? And you'll see that if you kind of go and look at the web page, usually you'll see what the fonts are. You kind of scroll through it all. A lot of these are overridden properties, quite a lot of crazy stuff, but eventually you'll find like the font family. You know, where is it? So many attributes. Like these complicated sites like Airbnb have so much stuff. Font family inherit. Great. Okay. Well, I don't know what Airbnb's font is. I could probably Google it. Airbnb font. Bellow regular. Now, here's the interesting thing about, you know, fonts generally. I can use this font here if I want to, right? So for instance, I could, inside the body, I could go and set the font family of the body to Bellow regular. But here's the tricky part. Bellow regular is not a font. And this is where fonts are awful. Not awful, they're just, you know, different. Is like, the fonts that you use when you load a page, they come from the computer. They're like a system thing. It's not like fonts exist in the browser. Your computer right now actually has a whole bunch of fonts that it knows that it can use and how to use. And that's it. You know? And therefore, when you ask to use a font that your computer's not aware of, it doesn't work unless you either A, install the font, or B, modern browsers actually can in themselves kind of externally import a font from another website. But then it gets even trickier because fonts sometimes look different on different systems, and they look different depending on like how you've got your DPI set up and a whole bunch of other stuff. So for the assignment, we actually kind of just like typically ask you to use a font that looks not terrible as a starting point. Now, obviously the default font here, Times New Roman, looks remarkably different to this like Bell Arial thing. So if you look at like slightly more, blocky fonts like Arial, you'll see that it immediately starts to look a lot better. And then there's what's that one that was like really default for a while, Calibri or whatever. Like that's starting to look pretty close already. So for the assignment, we typically just like get you to use fonts like this because it's like, well, it's close enough, and therefore we don't want you obsessing about it because it's actually really hard for you to get it right, and you're on Windows, and then a tutor loads up Mac on a discrepancies are just, they exist with text. It's kind of a nightmare. So let's say we have something like this. Well, what's a few things we notice? Well, naturally this image here is a little shifted to the right, but we can kind of ignore that. One of the obvious ones is that the country name is in bold. Okay, that's easy enough. Simple. Cool. We notice that there's like some interesting spacing between these things, as in the last item here looks like the money looks like it has a slight margin with respect to everything else. So, I'm going to add that little bit of a margin there between those two things. I can also see that there's a bit more space with respect to the top image. So I add like another 5 pixels. Yeah, okay, that's like maybe enough. But it also just generally the font size of this section is not the best. So what I might do is I might wrap all these divs in another div like this. And just be like font size, with font sizes, I think there is a fonts lecture. I can't remember if it's early on in the course or later, but using like EM is usually a good point. Like if you think 1 EM is a standard size, it's sometimes good to do like partial sizes like that. So if I do like 1.1, that starts to get our text a little bit closer. You can also see that the kilometers and the 13th to the 18th of April are actually like a bit of a lighter gray. So what I might do is I might wrap both of those here, right? And make them like, some gray color. One really easy thing is I always remember this, like if you understand hex, it's really easy to kind of pick colors because like FFF is white and 000 is like black. So it's like, okay, that's black, that's slightly less black, that's slightly less black, that's slightly less black, right? All the way up to 999. And I usually just try and remember, I just use 000, 333, 666, 999, CCC, and FFF. They're like the ones I mainly use to like ballpark stuff. So I saw 999 was a little bit too gray, so I might make it a bit darker, which is like 666. And this will probably get us closer. Like that's starting to feel a little bit better already, right? Okay, cool. Looks like they used an EM dash for the dates. How do you do that in HTML? Usually in HTML, there's some like, if you Google like HTML entities, they'll have like a whole bunch of like, what would you put it? Like, here's not great, but like you can Google like HTML entity dash, long dash or something. And you usually get like, sometimes you can just copy them straight in. You don't even need to do anything fancy, because it's just a different character. It's like now we've actually just used that as like, you don't even have to use any weird HTML entities. But for some other things, sometimes you want to use entities. Like a good example is that sometimes there are symbols that you want to use, like copyright. And some, like most of these days, text editors are smart enough that you can actually just copy them in like that. It's pretty cool. In the heyday, you had to actually copy these like little ways of expressing them, and the browser would then render it. This was kind of back when the browser could render things, but text editors were kind of ASCII or some enriched version of that. Whereas the UTF-8 thing can take emojis and everything. That's actually a crazy thing. I always find this interesting. Is like how editors these days will just tolerate anything. You kind of forget it. At least I forget it as a programmer. It's kind of funny to me. I forget that most editors will just kind of save and render emojis. It's kind of a funny idea to me. But you can see here we're nearly there. We've got this star. I could like Google HTML star. Oops. Take a break soon. HTML star. What do I get? Star symbols. That's looking pretty good. Okay. Ooh, look at this one. Symbol code. What when I click on that? Can I copy it? Is that what just happened? Cool. There you go. See? Easy. Star. Looks pretty good. We got some alignment things, right? You know, so we kind of want to move this block over to the right-hand side. To do that, there's a couple of things you can do. Generally, for me, I like to use floats for this kind of thing, just because I think floats work really well when you have like something you just want to move over to the other side. But obviously, this doesn't work because all of these divs here are not... Divs are by default with 100%. So in this case, because this div with the font size, we need to bound it just like we did with the image box where we say it's a 320 pixel width. Like that, you know. And, you know, now it's kind of looking pretty good. Yeah, Blake has a good point. There's a text align property you can use. That works really well if you kind of have everything on the same section. So for instance, like if there was only, like a good example would be these dates here. If these dates were like the only thing on that line, then you can apply a text align to the right-hand side, but it doesn't work too well when you have a couple things in the same line, because then it kind of shifts everything across, and if you play around with it, it starts to become, you know, a bit clearer, really. Okay, what else do people want to critique about this before we kind of move on and take a break? Where are the dots? Oh no, the dots. Oh, okay. These dots down here. I'm not going to do different sizes, but oh, dots. Let's make some dots. So let's try and put some dots. Let's make a dot. Div style equals. You can make dots 100 different ways, you know. You could use an SVG, you could use, I'm sure there's an HTML entity or a Unicode. For fun, I'm going to make like my own dot, like a 5 pixel by 5 pixel background white dot. Okay, there's the dot. It's probably hiding up there. I might need to like move it into a better position. Margin left 20 pixels. There's my dot. And I'll give it some margin at the top just to shift it down as well, right? Why did that not go down? That's really weird. I don't know. I'll look at that in a sec. But I also want to make it circular. So what I can actually do is just give it a border radius. And all the border radius needs is to be like half the width, which gives me something like that, right? So it's like, okay, now I have a dot. Is that dot too small? A little bit. We could probably make it slightly bigger. We could probably, let's see, 10 pixels I feel is like a little big. Maybe I'll make it like 8 or something. Yeah, it's a, I don't know. Let's just go with 8. Doesn't really matter, you know. So there's my dot. And now I want to go put those dots in the right spot. But there are a few dots. So something I can do here is I'm probably going to go and, similar to before, create a section for the dots at the bottom, you know. And to do that, one thing that could be handy is actually creating like an absolute positioned element again. That's like on, like let's say like 50 pixels from the bottom, and I'll put hello here. Now you can see I've got some text hello, but 50 pixels from the bottom is like really far. That was crazy. So maybe it should just be like 10 pixels from the bottom. And then we want to center it somehow, right? And again, there's a few different ways. So Blake's already talking about 5 dots in a flexbox. That's a totally fine way to do it. You could just kind of create a flex box at the bottom and center bottom align them. It really depends on how specific you need to get, you know, like generally I would, you know, if it needs to be down to a T, sometimes it can be easier to just use positioning and getting the pixels really right. If it's something that needs to be quite responsive and dynamic, Flexbox is usually like completely unbeatable. But let's say that I think all the boxes are gonna, all the dots are gonna take up 60 pixels of space, right? So now this hello thing here is 60 pixels wide. You can see it like that. So what that means is that if I want to now say center align that, because it's a div with a width that's less than 100%, I can actually give it our left and right auto margin, like this. And where'd my hello go? Oh, it's still there? I don't know. Why is that? Oh, because it's position absolute. Yeah, so this is like a bit of a downside of like, this is where you start to get into like the chaos of HTML. So once something is position absolute, it kind of disregards your margins a bit. And again, a few different ways you go about this. You could start doing some funky stuff like, there's just always so many ways. If you wanted to stick with the position thing, one thing you could do is be like, well, instead of, if I know it's 60 pixels and I know that it's, 320 or something, then I could just say that, well, let's just, what's half of 320? It's 160. So move it roughly to the middle. But the problem with doing that, right, is that now the start of this is in the middle. So that like 60 pixel thing, if you look at it, it's actually like starting right in the middle, like that, But I don't want that. I want it to kind of start 30 pixels to the left. Because if it's 60 pixels, right, you don't want it to be right in the middle. You want it to be like halfway of halfway. And now we start to get something that's positioned a bit more correctly. We start to get something like this, Don't worry about where the text is, worry about where the box is. So it's like, okay, that looks interesting. If you wanted something a bit more dynamic, rather than specifying 130 pixels, you can actually specify like 50% of the width minus 30 pixels. There's calc as a pretty cool function that lets things be more dynamic. This is really useful if the element that you're dealing with can grow in size, because it will actually calculate in real time for you constantly, what 50% is minus 30 pixels, which is pretty convenient. Yeah, but now I can go put the dots inside of it. So let's say I like this dot that I made. I could go and just like put 5 of these here. This is a really good example of where classes can be really useful. If I actually just want to make like a dot class, and then I can go and just, copy all these properties here. Naturally, you probably wouldn't, normally if you had a dot, you'd honestly either use like an entity or an emoji or an image. You probably wouldn't construct, or an SVG really. This would not be how you would do it necessarily, but I'm just, doing things on the fly. We have like dot, 5 dots. There you go. All right, well, what's the problem now? The dots are all like on top of each other. That's because divs are block elements. Can we use spans? Spans aren't block elements, so they won't take up a whole line. Where did they go? So where did they go? I don't know why they disappeared. That's really weird. You can, if you want like a lot of the properties of a div, but you don't want it to be like totally inline, then you can always use this funny display inline block. This is really powerful with divs sometimes. Wow. That is quite interesting. See, we're starting to see some limitations of this approach, right? I'm not sure what's happening here. I assume this has something to do with the width of it. Yeah, so like Steven's on top of it. It's like, because the width is like that, 90 pixels, I'm actually not too sure. That's very, oh, margin left. Oh, that was silly. There we go. There's the dots. Now, naturally, you got to be careful here with this approach, because like, even though this looks centered, it's not actually centered, right? Because you can see there, if you look closely, the left dot's right on the edge and the right dot's not right on the edge. This is probably an example of where you could actually use a text align center, because like you have non-block elements inside of it. So let's see if this moves it. I'm going to watch this dot really closely as I refresh. Yay! So now that's centered. Now, maybe that's not the best approach, but it works. Generally, if it works, it's good enough. Cool. I'm happy enough with that. I think that's a good start. I hope we'll take a break in a sec. What I hope, and we'll see what we do after the break. Maybe we'll just talk about the assignment a bit and then finish up. These demos are meant to be kind of driven by you guys, but what I'm hoping that I can convey to you is the importance of just experimenting. Now, obviously, I can probably do this stuff a little quicker than many of you, because like I'm more familiar with a lot of the properties and how to poke it. But it's quite honestly like what I've done tonight. It's like you start with the basics and you just start edging it in bit by bit until you're happy with it. that's what you do. It's not more complicated than that, and it's sometimes it's something that isn't necessarily always intellectually hard. It just takes time, and you know, sometimes things are just really difficult to do. Sometimes there are certain structures or layouts that you just can't do an easy way, and you have to do a hard way. Sometimes there's a few different ways to do things. Yeah, my dev tools is going crazy up here. I don't know what's wrong with it. But anyway, let's take like a 5 to 10 minute break. We'll start up around in about 10 minutes, and we'll keep chatting for a bit, and then maybe talk about assignment 1. So thank you. Okay, let's quickly wrap this up. What I want to know before we finish off the HTML CSS stuff is just a fairly simple question. What more do people want to know? Or what, like after watching the week 1 lectures, where do people feel the most like they are missing an understanding still? We'll try and help some of those if we can. If there's nothing, we'll move on. Otherwise, we'll do that. Then we'll talk about assignment 1 a bit more. Okay, so some questions. Let me go through some questions. William says, do you set the viewport size in the metadata? Honestly, what I would do for the assignment is I would, like, for the fixed image ones, I would just go and actually just like make a div with a black border, and I would just code within that. That's all I'd do. Just like have it full screen, but have like a div that's smaller than the screen. Like you can do you could also like, you can do that approach, or you can also like open dev tools, and you can go to mobile mode if you want, and you can specify it. You could be like, let's go like 1200 by 788. That's the other approach you can take. It's kind of up to you, really. There's a few different. It doesn't really matter because your tutor's just going to look at it and they're just going to mark it. So whatever works for you. But I think just a div with a black border and then doing all your work inside of it's totally fine. Steven says, what are the limit of CSS? I don't know what you mean by the limit of CSS. You might have to elaborate on that one. Jaden says PT versus EM. So when you're setting font size, what's the difference between PT and EM? I did a deep dive on this a couple of years ago, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but what I remember was that there was some good reading about it, which was basically saying there was like a problem with PT. I think PT had something to do with that it's from typewriters, or it's used in print media. 1 point is equal to 1/72 of an inch. And I think the problem with that is that it's coming back to me. It's like they're fixed size. You're kind of specifying pixels. And this gets really tricky, for instance, on, because what you got to understand is that when I zoom in like this, right, I'm obviously zooming in and out of the whole web page. But there are ways, like take edge increase font size. I can go to like settings, appearance, and I can probably change the font. Someone see font size. I can make my font size very large, and when we go back to a web page now, or maybe let's see what happens, very small. Okay, is it gonna do anything? Oh, this is like default text. I don't know. But basically the point is that there are certain like accessibility tools and stuff, which what they do is they kind of set font sizes for browsers. So in some cases, I'm out of my depth here, I haven't done this before, but in some cases what can happen is your font can increase or decrease based on what people's settings are. So you can kind of have like a default font on the computer. And the reason EM is really useful, and same with percentages, is because 1 EM or 100% is kind of like the default font size. So what that means is that when you go and say something like, this font should be bigger than that font, 1.1 EM or 1.2 EM or 2 EM, you are kind of saying, I want this to be like 1.1 times the normal font size, or like 110% the normal font size. So what you're doing is you're leaving the power in the hands of the user and the browser to do what is right for that particular person. That's why PT is bad, because it's very fixed. The problem with doing the whole kind of scaling percentage thing, though, is that sometimes you need fonts to be a certain size. Sometimes you're building these really elaborate web pages, like Airbnb, where they've got, all this text here, and the font just can't get bigger without breaking the page. So sometimes you do just have to set the font size to be a certain thing. But the short answer is I'd probably lean towards doing the EM or the percentages. Generally, I do like a lot of the EM stuff. Blake says, I feel like I understand all the concepts, just having trouble getting the things exactly right. Yeah, that's pretty much a pretty standard experience. So, it takes a while to get things exactly right. Like those dots before, even me, I'm like, I don't want to do those dots. I'm thinking flex, I'm thinking positions, Google stuff. A lot of the time you can kind of Google problems like, center, bottom align multiple elements, CSS, and look for some examples. Sometimes you can go to websites you like Airbnb, and you can just inspect the elements, right? Like, what are Airbnb doing with these 3 dots? God, their thing is difficult to navigate. God, I don't want to deconstruct all of this. Looks very confusing. I don't know. Could spend a lot of time there. Gordon says, to be honest, I'm still struggling with the difference between padding, margins, and use cases for them. So the benefit of like padding and margins, I think, is that they, if you actually open an element, you'll actually see that they actually have a little model for it here, in the dev tools. I know my head's in the way, but there's the element, there's the padding around it, there's the border around that, and there's the margin around that. So if you want to think about it, padding and border are kind of the same thing. There's a few subtle differences between them sometimes, but you'll kind of uncover those naturally. But the main thing is that a padding includes the background and is inside the border. So for example, if I have a div, right? Let's say I have a div. And this div might be like, width and height 100 pixels. And let's say I give it like a blue background. Like this. The div's 100 pixels. If I add padding, and let's say I give it a border, maybe I'll make it a lighter color like yellow. And let's say I give it a border, 1 pixel solid, that. Yeah, like this. Cool. Well, in this case, if I add padding to it, like 30 pixels of padding, it's going to add that padding inside the border and expand the background. Whereas if I add 30 pixels of margin, it's going to add that to the outside of everything. And I get this effect. And when I inspect it, you'll be able to see this a bit more. Oh God, just be smaller, please. You'll be able to see this a bit more clearly if I get rid of there. See, like element, padding, border, margin. Now the margin on the right hand side is really big because it's a div, and it's a div means divs by default take up all of the the horizontal width on the page. Stephen says, adding on to Gordon's question, when I was doing assignment 1 in Photopia or Photopea, I never know what to call it, to find the pixels for padding and margin, but the spacing looks a bit off. Do we trust our eyes to adjust the spacing? I would generally trust your eyes, yeah. I do a lot of stuff just by eye, like these hearts and stuff, but like the main reason that link is there is not because we're like, you have to use this, it's just because, like, that looks fine. Maybe there's a couple pixels off, I don't know. It's just because students otherwise, kind of are like, I don't know what it is, and I feel like I'm guessing, and it's like, well, here's a tool so you don't have to guess. Yeah. Rather than split up this lecture, I'm just gonna kind of chat about assignment 1 briefly whilst we're here. Now we already talked about this last week, so I don't think there's a ton to go through. But I just want to recap quickly now that you've kind of maybe had a week to digest things, and see if there are any kind of questions. But I feel like most of them come up on the forum. If you haven't had a look at this yet, I'd encourage you to go and look at it again now, because it's actually like not too bad. Like when you look at something like this is obviously colored, centered, large text. There's obviously a gap here, maybe a margin underneath it. These are 3 images. They could be fixed size, they could be flex, doesn't really matter, it's kind of up to you. You typically have this outer box as a div. That div's going to have a margin. Each of those boxes will have a margin. Inside of that div's going to be an image up the top, probably an image tag's fine, and then underneath it you're just going to have 2 divs or spans with center aligned text, right? And maybe one of them's going to have a color. That's it. That one's actually a pretty, pretty manageable thing. There is a border shadow, yes. It's very subtle. Something like this nearly isn't a border shadow as much as sometimes it's just the borders are sometimes different. Like you can do it either way, right? You can either create like a 1 pixel box shadow, or you can kind of set different colors for the shadows. To be honest with you, I don't think it's likely to notice except the top one. You can see the top one doesn't really have a border. Yeah. But like when we come down here, this one's a little bit more interesting. This one's kind of a bit more involved. This one's a big positioning exercise, right? Obviously, like from the last exercise, you can probably just copy and paste your work because you've got, like text, 3 blocks, fixed size, really easy. But you're dealing with a section up the top, an icon, some text that's a little off center. This exercise is really playing a lot with like centers, position absolutes, margins, and padding, right? So this is like a positioning exercise. Probably the most annoying part of it is going to be this like text here, where you've got like little text, big text, because again, like, there's no real like standard way in CSS just to say like align the text to the top. Like you nearly need to I would nearly encourage you all to not try and find elegant ways to solve this one. And what I mean by that is, just be like, yep, this thing here, oops, sorry, I'm not on the screen. This thing here, 1 div, these 3 things, 3 separate divs, all like aligned very specifically by pixel. I wouldn't get caught up in trying to generalize it or make it super elegant. I would just go and get it looking right. Xavier says, do we need to find a similar arrow emoji? No, it's fine. Like, it's just a component. We're not going to mark you down because you have the wrong component. If you really put a clown there and we're like, well, it could have been anything, I'd probably still give you the mark because, we're only interested in like examining what we feel is like critical to learn. The third task is normally harder. This time I opted to make this one easier. So I'd say this one is about 10% harder for a second activity. This one is like 50+% easier. It's probably like 70% easier than what we normally ask here. The elements are really simple. This one is pretty much just like a flex question. I don't mean flex as in, weird flex, but like a flex box question where we're like, here's some components, here's some stuff. All you have to do is structure it so that when you resize the browser between these 2 things, it behaves, That's what we're asking for there. Fairly manageable. Question 4, I think will be easier to chat about next week after we do some more JavaScript stuff. And Todd says, do we have to use position for task 2? No. You can use tons of stuff. You could use floats. You could use position. Like, it's not that bad when you think about it, right? Like, you have a box. The button and the text here are all just center aligned with different sizes, colors, and margins between them. Pretty easy. The top bar is like interesting. There's this line here. It's a bit weird. But this text is just, this is just an element and a text with some padding on the left. Really easy. The hard part's just this thing here, because you've got these weird components. I'll show you what I mean. The problem is how browsers render text by default. That's the problem. Because by default, if you ask a browser to render text like this, if you say like span, and you're like, hello, my name is Hayden. And maybe there's a way to do this and I just don't know. But the problem is if I go and get name, and I go and make that like font size 2em, like twice the normal font size, or hell, let's make it 3 times the normal font size. It typically does that. I don't know if browsers have a way to like align text to the top. I don't think so. I could be wrong. If they are, then great. I'm an idiot. But that's why this one's hard, because you kind of can't just be like, here's a text and I'll make this bigger. You kind of have to break them up nearly into like, separate components, is what I'd say. Like that's kind of the right approach here, is to do that and, wrap it all in a div. There might be, oh yeah, sup does the job. That's good. See, someone knows stuff. Yeah, there we go. And you can just style that differently. This one's a bit interesting because this one, like, this is what I mean. Everything's like, a lot of stuff is kind of a hack. Like, this isn't vertically aligned. This is a tag that's essentially like 2 squared. Like how do you represent, yeah, literally. Like how do you just, like in Microsoft Word, make it like smaller and up the top. And that could work if you play around with some other CSS properties and stuff. You could kind of get it there. It's just a lot of trial and error, and I'm pretty happy with the size of this assignment. I think task 2 is a positioning one. Task 3 is a flex one. Task 3 is probably easier than task 2 unless you really are struggling with Flexbox and just getting familiar and comfortable with it. I think we're getting to the end now, so I'd just like to ask if there's any final questions before we wrap up. Should we be using comments? I don't think I asked for it when I wrote the assignment. I don't think I care. No. Make your code readable. Like, if your code's a nightmare, you maybe want to consider comments. We will be marking your assignment on a local Google Chrome. Either on Windows, Linux, or Mac. Steven says, is it considered bad style to use like tons of divs other than sections? No, that's pretty normal. Most websites are built like that these days. Can we use Flexbox for both task 1 and 2? You can, but like please feel free to. I think it's good practice, but generally Flex's benefits aren't felt if you're working with fixed size components. Gordon says, I think the rule of thumb is that skeleton sections is for things that you will draw on a rough sketch of a skeleton of your website. Yeah, I think sections are just like, sections are just big sections. It's really just, most websites might be like, GitLab. It's made up of a sidebar, header bar, this main bit, a couple of sections. Probably. I don't really know what the formal definition of it is. What do they say? Defines a section. What is an HTML section? Related content. It's a decent definition. The section element should only be used if there isn't a more specific element to represent the section. Yeah, whatever you want it to be. All right. I'm conscious that people are starting to drop off and we're kind of reaching the limits of things. So let's wrap up. Any last emergency questions? Otherwise, we're gonna close it off. William says, when I add the line height, it applies to top and bottom. I believe that's how line height works. If you want to affect only the top or bottom, you're probably going to have to use like a marginal padding and have like a separate span or div element. We did that here, right? This is how we did that here. We kind of adjusted the line height by putting a margin or padding at the top or bottom. Cool. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. Enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll chat soon. Send you an email on Friday. See ya.